So for the financial year beginning January 1st, 2023, issuers in the financial and energy industries, along with those involved in agriculture, food and forestry products, will be subject to mandatory climate-related reporting. So this will expand to include issuers from the materials, buildings and transportation industries in 2024. Tell us a bit more about why SGX introduced this rule back in December 2021.
We really started as an exchange in promoting sustainability disclosures in 2011 when we asked companies to voluntarily put out a sustainability report. In 2016, we upgraded this to a listing requirement and required all companies to produce a sustainability report. In 2017, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, was set up, and they published a set of voluntary recommendations that all companies should put out in relation to the climate-related risks and opportunities that are facing the companies. And in 2019, we conducted a survey and review of the sustainability reports of our company. I think what we found is that half of our companies identified climate change as a material ESG factor that is affecting their business. 1/3 of them put out some form of matrix to track their exposures, such as greenhouse gas emissions. But only 2% of these companies actually use the recommendations of the TCFD, which is, I think, the globally recognized framework that's useful for climate disclosures. And that is why in 2021, we conducted a series of consultations and a public one to look at adopting TCFD reporting across all companies. So we decided that it is probably appropriate to introduce a phased approach to gradually move all companies toward this trajectory. What we did is to ask more carbon-intensive industries such as financial, energy, agriculture, food and forest products to start reporting on a mandatory basis, and then with other more carbon-intensive ones like materials and buildings and transportation to follow in subsequent years.
So for the retail investors that are watching this, why should they care about climate-related financial disclosures? What should they look out for when the first of such reports are published next year?
For retail investors, probably suggest maybe 3 R's that they can consider. I suggest firstly to read the sustainability report, whether contained within the annual report or as a standalone statement. Secondly, research. Look at how your portfolio company is performing against their peers in the industry, and this would then give you a basis for comparison to see whether or not your portfolio company is dealing with the types of risks that generally affect that industry. I think the third R is really reach out. Reach out to your portfolio company if you have questions. If you have questions about the business of the company, about the strategy of the company, about what you feel are the upcoming risks that might affect the company that you feel that the company has not addressed, I think the annual general meeting is a perfect forum for retail investors to reach out to the management and board of directors of their portfolio companies and ask these questions.
Right, so read, research and reach out. Okay, very easy to remember here. How would this affect investment portfolios, you think? Why are climate-related disclosures important?
I'm a retail investor myself, but I'm also an accountant and auditor. So, I read a lot of financial statements, annual reports. Increasingly in the world we are in, right, it's no longer just about financial information and financial risk. It's a lot to do with non-financial information and non-financial risk as well. So climate-related risks and opportunities is clearly one that we are confronted with and will have a very tangible impact on companies' bottom line, be it now or the near term or the longer term as well. So I think as a savvy investor, I think it's only right that, we really read through all this information, including sustainability reports, as well as the sort of climate-related disclosures that now is mandated for the listed companies, right? To really evaluate how these companies are making themselves more resilient as we all transition towards a greener future.
Maybe an observation for your your retail investors. Who emits carbon? Business, economic activity. Why does business emit carbon? It emits carbon as our proxy. Business is producing the goods and services that we, the retail investors, consume. So actually, the buck stops with us. If we believe in a sustainable future, if we want to invest responsibly in a sustainable future, then we need to discriminate where we put our dollar and which companies that we patronize. So it's actually our power to make a change.
when I think about the framework that we've put in place for Visa, it actually, to Michael's earlier point, also allows some sort of benchmarking against your peer. So if you're consuming, how do you know if you're consuming on the high range or the low range for carbon emissions? So coming up with a framework that allows you to not only just know the number of kilograms per dollar of spend that you're actually producing, it also allows you to benchmark yourself against your peers. Like, is there a greener way for you to spend your dollar? That's what the framework aims to do, to help educate both consumers and businesses on the ways that they are spending.
So staying on comparisons, now that we're in the third quarter of the year, how have the financial and energy companies been preparing for this climate-related disclosure? Does SGX RegCo consult or check in with them from time to time?
I'm glad you asked. We are actually in the process of analyzing the results. So the new rule takes effect from financial years ending 31st December 2022. So we're expecting, we have seen the first reports coming out from April to May of this year, and progressively we'll see more coming on. Like I mentioned, we're doing a systematic review of all the reports by our companies, but already I think in the market there are several surveys being conducted by various organizations. I think PwC has published one survey recently. More than 90% of Singapore companies that they've surveyed actually do identify the climate-related risks and opportunities in their disclosures. More than 70% of them track the progress of their climate-related risks and opportunities as part of the process. This is gratifying to see that companies are starting to embrace this concept of dealing with and disclosing on their climate impacts. What will be critical to get companies to take even more serious and enhanced action would be the leverage that the wider community can place on companies. So I think May and Nick mentioned about the power of consumers in giving us information on this pressure and discriminating against more sustainable products and services, how retail investors can play that role, and telling the companies that they invest in that they need to be more sustainable.
It is quite a challenge to put a number on carbon and carbon dioxide emissions here. So what are some of the tools available to them? What are some of the forms of assistance that SGX is rendering to these companies?
Maybe if I could give an overview of what the TCFD has recommended that all companies produce. It is a set of disclosure framework, and what it has recommended to all companies to disclose is centered around 4 different pillars of disclosures. And these are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Now, under each of these different pillars, the TCFD has recommended different types of disclosures that would aid investors in assessing the climate performance of their companies. The measurement of the greenhouse gas emissions for companies can be challenging, particularly when you are looking at more indirect forms of carbon emissions, which a company needs to report on. We have various tools as well as training programs that we've introduced for our companies to help them with this process. One of the, I think, digital tools that we've introduced about a year or so ago is ESGenome. This is a reporting portal that will allow companies to input their sustainability information, such as greenhouse gas emissions, the role of the board of directors in supervising sustainability within the company. All these different data points can be put into this electronic online portal, and through this portal a simplified form of sustainability report can be generated as a first draft for the company to consider and to add on and ameliorate. So the next stage of this evolution of the platform would really be to allow investors to access the information in a systematic, consistent and comparable manner.
PwC says the call for action to integrate ESG into portfolios and strategies has resulted in some challenges for asset managers in particular. So what are some of these challenges in your view?
What we just discussed was the climate-related disclosure requirements for listed companies by SGX. At the same time, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS in short, also came up with this parallel set of requirements for financial institutions called the MAS Guidelines on Environmental Risk Management for banks, for asset managers, and also for insurers. And that came into effect around June last year. We actually surveyed a number of asset managers in Singapore before these guidelines became effective to understand where they are at in terms of their implementation progress and what are some of the common challenges that they faced. Some of the key challenges highlighted were around the availability and quality of data to allow these asset managers to make meaningful decisions from a tactical and strategic perspective. That's one. Second is around the capabilities and expertise to undertake some of the more technically complex areas of the requirements. In the last 2 years, when we did our global investor survey at PwC, right, one of the findings was that more than 80% of the investors surveyed actually told us that while they are keen to pursue ESG strategies, they will not accept anything more than a 1 percentage point reduction in investment returns. A lot of the asset managers are carefully approaching this. So I think a lot of them started out perhaps taking small actions to align themselves more from a regulatory compliance perspective, rather than truly, integrating and embedding ESG into their investment philosophy, their corporate purpose, and also the way they conduct their business.
We heard about the ISSB around June. There's the International Sustainability Standards Board. So how would the panel describe what the standards bring to the table here? And in your own words, how would that change or shape how we do disclosures in the future?
We are inventing a new language and a new skill set as we look at non-financial reporting. So the first thing we need to understand is when companies and corporates disclose information, what do they mean? And so having a common taxonomy in the same way as we have a common taxonomy for financial statements that is well adopted around the world. So as companies, global companies, compile their consolidated financial statements, there's confidence in the information and an understanding of what it means. And that's the journey that we're now on for non-financial disclosure. And so the first two of the standards that the ISSB or ISB have set out are being adopted in a number of key jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, where the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has just become effective. And that is giving us that first step of confidence. So just reporting on it doesn't solve the issue, but at least setting boundaries on materiality, for example, in a business is important, and that standard that ISB is introducing is a very important first step in that.
For retail investors, and actually for me as well, I think it gets a bit hard to keep up with all the developments, but I thought it's useful to think about all these framework developments in three buckets of things. I think the first bucket is where ISSB sits. It sets out the reporting standard. I think another bucket of frameworks that you might hear would be taxonomy. And these are, I think, performance-related aspects. For example, set a standard on whether or not the level of operations that the activity is operating under is in fact aligned to a low-carbon trajectory. I think a third bucket of things that you might hear would be ratings, like ESG ratings conducted by rating agencies. I think this is similar to credit ratings of companies that you hear from the credit rating agencies. It gives a sense of what the credit rating agencies think about the performance of the company, whether on its credit or on its sustainability performance. I think individual investors would probably have to have their own sense on whether or not what has been disclosed is suitable or appropriate.
So have there been any notable high-profile cases, in your view, of companies that have failed to achieve this, and whether this was intentional or otherwise?
We were talking earlier about data sets. There is an enormous new challenge around identifying appropriate verifiable data. Most of it will also be digital. And so the way that companies communicate, I think, will be changing. Today, sustainable finance still has some relatively lightweight controls because we don't have the data that we need. But with new data in the future will come new metrics and will come new standards, and that will start to drive real change through the data that we're able to generate and review in the future, both at an individual company level, but also at a sector or a regional level as that data is collected. Greenwashing has largely been to date a reputational risk, perhaps brought by NGOs or shareholders. And a number of financial institutions in particular have been pulled up in relation to greenwashing allegations. And once it becomes a conduct issue, that's a lot more serious. That is still reputational, but there's also accountability for the senior management and possibly financial penalties as well.
I know that Visa classifies some expenditures to come from green merchants. So tell me more about this label. How does your team decide what is a green merchant and what is not?
A framework that we use that's called the Visa Sustainability Index, and that takes transaction data on VisaNet and combines it with some external information related to sectoral emissions to come up with CO2 emissions down to the dollar at the merchant category level. But on top of that, we worked with a sustainability consultancy called NG Impact, and we came up with a sustainable business scorecard that basically scores brands based on the actions that they have taken to become more sustainable. So the scorecard actually assesses the brands based on 3 components. The first is on their emissions data management. The second is around their commitment to net zero. And lastly, the actual actions they've taken around decarbonization. And then that gets put together in a score. And I guess the green merchants would get ranked based on that score. So when we think about, I guess the most simple analogy would be if you were to have a card, credit card that you are using, if you were to shop at such an identified green merchant with such a label, then the bank could potentially reward cardholders for those actions by saying, we could give you more rewards, more cash back when you shop at greener merchants, all as part of the push towards helping consumers and even businesses that are using purchasing cards to move to a more sustainable purchasing pattern.
Right, sounds like a good idea to drive behavioral consumer patterns as well. Yeah. So thank you for tuning in to Planet Edge, a special panel discussion on sustainability and ESG investing by The Edge Singapore. For the latest news in investing in Singapore and the region, visit theedgesingapore.com and follow us on our social media channels.